It was a cold November night in 1959 when two ex-convicts drove through the darkness toward the Clutter farm. They believed they would find a safe full of money. Instead, they would commit one of the most notorious family murders in American history. By morning, 4 innocent people would be dead, executed with a shotgun in the basement of their own home. The killers would flee into the night, beginning a cross-country manhunt that would end in the electric chair. November 15th, 1959, Holcomb, Kansas. A prosperous farming family, brutally slaughtered for a safe that didn't exist. 2 killers on the run, and a crime so shocking it would inspire one of the most famous true crime books ever written. Tonight we explore the murders that Truman Capote immortalized in Cold Blood, a case that reveals the terrifying randomness of evil and sets the stage for another unsolved mystery that may be connected. Welcome back to Deadly Intent, where we descend into the darkest corners of the human psyche to understand what drives ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. I'm your host, Carmen Carrion, and tonight we're traveling to the wheat fields of western Kansas, to a crime that shattered America's sense of rural safety and spawned a new genre of true crime storytelling. This is the story of the Clutter family murders. 4 lives ended in cold blood by strangers who had never met their victims. A crime that proved evil doesn't discriminate, and killers that may have struck again before justice caught up with them. In 1959, Holcomb, Kansas was the embodiment of American innocence. Population 270. A farming community carved from the endless wheat plains of western Kansas, where the horizon stretched in every direction and the sky seemed to go on forever. This was a place where everyone knew everyone, where children walked to school alone through fields of grain, and where folks rarely locked their doors because there was nothing to fear. The closest thing to excitement in Holcomb was the weekly livestock auction or the annual wheat harvest festival. Crime was limited to the occasional drunk and disorderly or teenage vandalism. Murder was something that happened in big cities, something you read about in newspapers from places like Chicago or New York. The Clutter family embodied everything good and prosperous about small-town America. They were what every farming family aspired to become: successful, respected, deeply rooted in their community and their faith. Herbert William Clutter was 48 years old, a man who had built his success through hard work, integrity, and an unwavering belief in the Protestant work ethic. Standing 6 feet tall with graying hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, Herb was exactly what central casting would have ordered for the role of the ideal American farmer. But Herb was far more than just a farmer. He was a businessman, a community leader, and a visionary who had transformed his inherited land into one of the most successful agricultural operations in western Kansas. River Valley Farm sprawled across thousands of acres, employing 18 full-time workers and generating substantial income from wheat, cattle, sheep, and various other crops. Herb didn't drink, didn't smoke, and didn't allow alcohol or cigarettes in his house. He was a devout Methodist who believed that success came from hard work and moral living. His word was his bond, and his handshake was worth more than most written contracts. In a community where reputation meant everything, Herb Clutter's reputation was spotless. His wife, Bonnie Mae Fox Clutter, 45, presented a more complex picture. Once vivacious and outgoing, Bonnie had struggled for years with what they called nervous troubles in that era. Severe depression that came and went in debilitating waves. Modern medicine might have been able to help her, but in 1959, mental health treatment was primitive and often ineffective. Despite her illness, Bonnie was beloved by those who knew her. When she was well, she was a gentle soul who taught Sunday school, organized church socials, and tended to her family with quiet devotion. Her struggles with depression had made her more compassionate, not less, and she was known throughout the community for her kindness to anyone who was suffering. The Clutter children were the pride of their parents' lives, each embodying the best qualities of their mother and father. Nancy Mae Clutter, 16, was everything a teenage girl in 1959 was supposed to be. Pretty, popular, talented, and wholesome. With blonde hair and bright blue eyes, she had inherited her father's confidence and her mother's gentle nature. Nancy was class president at Holcomb High School, a skilled horsewoman who showed horses at county fairs, an accomplished pianist who played for church services, and a natural leader who somehow managed to be popular without making enemies. She was engaged to her high school sweetheart, Bobby Rupp, the star of the basketball team, and the kind of clean-cut young man that parents dreamed their daughters would marry. Nancy and Bobby's relationship was the talk of Holcomb. Two attractive, successful young people who seemed destined for a storybook marriage and a bright future. But Nancy wasn't just a pretty face. She was also practical and hardworking, helping with household chores, cooking meals, and managing many of the day-to-day responsibilities that her mother's illness sometimes made difficult. Nancy had that rare combination of beauty, intelligence, and kindness that made her beloved by everyone who knew her. Kenyon Neal Clutter, 15, was quieter than his sister, but equally gifted in his own way. Tall for his age and still growing into his lanky frame, Kenyon had inherited his father's thoughtful temperament and methodical approach to life. He was an aspiring carpenter who spent countless hours in the basement workshop, building furniture and dreaming of architectural projects that would showcase his growing skills. Kenyon's basement workshop was his sanctuary, filled with carefully organized tools, stacks of lumber, and half-finished projects that demonstrated real talent and ambition. He had recently completed a hope chest for Nancy, a beautiful piece of furniture that she planned to fill with linens and household items for her future marriage to Bobby Rupp. Unlike many teenage boys, Kenyon was comfortable spending time alone. He was thoughtful, introspective, with a maturity that impressed adults and made him a natural leader among his peers. Teachers and neighbors often commented that Kenyon had an old soul, the kind of steady, reliable character that suggested he would grow up to be very much like his father. Two older daughters had already left home to pursue their own dreams. Ivana, who was studying nursing in Kansas City, following in the tradition of service that her parents had instilled. Beverly was married and living in Kansas City with her husband, building the kind of stable, loving family that the Clutters represented. On November 14, 1959, it was just Herb, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon in the big white house on River Valley Farm. The house itself reflected the family's success and values, well-maintained, tastefully furnished, filled with the comfortable touches that made it a real home rather than just a showplace. It was a family that seemed blessed by every measure that mattered in 1959 America. Financial success, community respect, loving relationships, bright futures, stretching ahead like the endless Kansas horizon. They had no enemies, no serious conflicts, no reason to fear for their safety in their quiet corner of the world. They had no idea that their name was already written on a list in a prison cell, hundreds of miles away, placed there by a small-time criminal who had heard rumors of wealth and imagined riches that existed only in his fantasy. To understand the horror that descended on the Clutter family, we need to meet the two men who would destroy them, Richard Eugene Dick Hickock and Perry Edward Smith. Their partnership was forged in the crucible of Kansas State Penitentiary, where they discovered in each other the perfect criminal complement. Cunning paired with violence, manipulation matched with explosive rage. Dick Hickock was 28 years old, a charming sociopath whose easy smile and smooth talk masked a complete absence of conscience or empathy. Of average height but powerfully built, with dark hair and eyes that could shift from friendly to predatory in an instant. Hickock was the kind of man who could talk his way into or out of almost any situation. Married with children, Hickock was also a habitual criminal who saw other people as marks to be exploited rather than fellow human beings deserving of respect or consideration. He was a check forger, a thief, and a sexual predator, with a particular appetite for teenage girls. Hickock possessed the sociopath's ability to compartmentalize his life, playing the role of devoted husband and father, while secretly planning crimes and pursuing his deviant interests. What made Hickock especially dangerous was his intelligence and charisma. He wasn't a crude criminal who relied on brute force. Instead, he was manipulative, calculating, always working several angles at once. He could befriend someone while simultaneously planning to rob them, seduce women while plotting to abandon them, and charm authority figures while secretly despising them. Hickock's criminal history revealed an escalating pattern of antisocial behavior. He had progressed from petty theft as a teenager to check forgery and more serious crimes as an adult. Each arrest, each stint in jail or prison, had only hardened his criminal resolve and expanded his knowledge of how to exploit others. Perry Edward Smith presented a more complex and troubled psychological profile. At 31, Smith was a drifter whose childhood read like a case study in how to create a killer. His early life was a catalog of abandonment, abuse, and institutional brutalization that had left deep psychological scars and a simmering rage that could explode without warning. Smith's father had abandoned the family when Perry was young, leaving his mother to raise several children in grinding poverty. When his mother proved unable to cope, Perry and his siblings were shuffled between relatives and institutions, including a Catholic orphanage where, according to Smith's later account, he was subjected to physical and sexual abuse. Reform school followed, then juvenile detention, then adult prison in a seemingly endless cycle of institutional confinement that had lasted for most of Smith's adult life. Each experience had been more brutalizing than the last, stripping away whatever capacity for trust or human connection he might once have possessed. But Smith wasn't a simple brute. He was intelligent, artistic, and capable of surprising gentleness. He could read and write well, had taught himself to play guitar, and often expressed himself in poetry and sketches that revealed a sensitive, even romantic nature. This contradiction between his capacity for violence and his artistic sensibilities would fascinate psychiatrists and writers for years to come. Smith was also deeply damaged psychologically. He suffered from what would now be recognized as severe mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder, certainly post-traumatic stress from his horrific childhood. He experienced mood swings that could take him from quiet introspection to explosive rage in moments, and he had a grandiose self-image that was constantly at war with his feelings of inadequacy and abandonment. The two men met in Kansas State Penitentiary, where Hickock was serving time for passing bad checks and Smith for burglary. In the gray, brutal world of prison, they found in each other something they had never found anywhere else: a perfect criminal partnership. Hickock provided the cunning, the planning ability, and the social skills needed to set up crimes. Smith provided the willingness to use violence, the physical capability to intimidate victims, and the psychological ruthlessness needed to eliminate witnesses. Together, they were far more dangerous than either man would have been alone. Here's where we need to understand the deadly intent that set this tragedy in motion. This wasn't a crime of passion or a random act of violence. This was calculated predation based on greed, fantasy, and a complete disregard for human life. The plan originated with a fellow inmate named Floyd Wells, who had once worked as a farmhand for Herbert Clutter. Wells told Hickock about the Clutter family's wealth, claiming, falsely, that Herb kept a safe in his house containing $10,000 in cash. Wells described the layout of the house, the family's routines, and the isolated location of the farm. But here's what reveals the killer's true psychology. Even as they planned what was supposedly a simple robbery, they discussed killing the family. This wasn't about eliminating witnesses after a crime gone wrong. From the very beginning, murder was part of their intent. Hickock later admitted that he was sexually attracted to Nancy Clutter, having seen her photograph in the local newspaper. The idea of having power over an attractive teenage girl was part of the crime's appeal for him. Smith was motivated by a combination of greed and a desire to prove himself capable of the ultimate criminal act. He had spent his entire adult life being brutalized by stronger men in various institutions, and the idea of being the one with ultimate power was intoxicating. Together they created a plan that was always going to end in death, regardless of what they found in the Clutter house. The robbery was just an excuse to gain entry. What they really wanted was the experience, the ultimate power, the power to decide who lived and who died. The psychological dynamics between Hickock and Smith were crucial to understanding how the crime unfolded. Hickock was the planner, the manipulator, who could envision the crime and figure out the logistics. But he was also, in some ways, a coward who preferred to let others do the actual violence. Smith, damaged and desperate for approval, was willing to be Hickock's instrument of violence in exchange for acceptance and partnership. This wasn't two criminals deciding to rob a house. This was two predators planning to hunt human prey, with the robbery serving as justification for what they really wanted to do: kill an entire family and experience the godlike power of deciding who lived and who died. Let me walk you through November 15th, 1959, the last day the Clutter family would spend on this earth. Understanding their final hours makes the tragedy even more poignant because it shows us a family living their normal, peaceful lives with no idea that evil was already in motion toward them. 6:30 a.m. Herbert Clutter woke early, as was his lifelong habit. A man who believed that early rising was both a moral virtue and a practical necessity. Herb began each day with the same routine. He showered, dressed in his usual work clothes, khaki pants, white shirt, and sturdy boots, and went downstairs to make coffee. 7 a.m. Bonnie Clutter remained in bed, struggling with one of her difficult periods. The depression that plagued her came in waves, and November had been a particularly hard month. On this Saturday morning, she felt the familiar weight of sadness and anxiety that made even simple tasks seem overwhelming. 7:15 a.m. Nancy Clutter bounded downstairs, full of the energy and optimism that characterized her approach to life. Nancy was 16 years old, a straight-A student who played clarinet in the high school band and was active in 4-H. She greeted her father warmly and began preparing breakfast for the family. 8 a.m. The family gathered for breakfast, a daily ritual that Herb insisted upon despite their busy schedules. They discussed plans for the upcoming week, school activities for Nancy and Kenyon, business meetings for Herb, and social obligations for the family. 9:30 a.m. After breakfast, Nancy helped with household tasks while Kenyon spent time in his basement workshop. Kenyon was 15 years old, a responsible young man who did well in school and played for his school basketball team, filled with carefully organized tools where he worked on carpentry projects. 12 p.m. The family gathered for Saturday dinner, continuing conversations about the week ahead. Nancy talked about school activities and her relationship with Bobby Rupp. Even Bonnie made an effort to join the family, despite her struggles with depression. 2 p.m. While the adults rested or read, Nancy drove to help teach a young neighbor how to make a cherry pie and give guitar lessons. This was typical of Nancy's generous nature. She was always helping younger children, sharing her skills with characteristic patience and kindness. 4:30 p.m. Nancy returned home to find Kenyon in his basement workshop, working on a wooden chest he was building as a Christmas present. He was meticulous in his work, taking pride in creating furniture that would last for generations. 7:30 p.m. Bobby Rupp arrived to spend the evening with Nancy, as he did most Saturday nights. Bobby was the kind of clean-cut young man that parents approved of, polite, hard-working, and genuinely devoted to Nancy. 11 p.m. Bobby Rupp prepared to leave, as he always did by 11 p.m., a curfew set by Herb that Bobby respected without question. He kissed Nancy goodnight on the porch, promised to call her the next day, and drove away into the darkness. He was the last person outside the family to see any of the Clutters alive. 11:15 p.m. Nancy locked the door behind Bobby and joined her family for their nightly routine. One by one, the family members said their goodnights and headed to their respective bedrooms. 12 a.m., Sunday, November 15th. The Clutter house was quiet and dark. The family slept peacefully in their beds, secure in their home and their community, with no idea that 2 ex-convicts were already driving across Kansas toward them, carrying shotgun shells and rope, and a plan that would end 4 innocent lives. This timeline reveals the ordinary, peaceful nature of the Clutters' final day. They lived exactly as they had lived hundreds of other days, centered on family, faith, and community. There was nothing dramatic or foreboding about November 15, 1959 for the Clutter family. It was simply the last of their normal days, made precious by the horror that was about to descend upon them. At approximately midnight on November 15th, Dick Hickock's 1949 Chevrolet pulled into the long driveway leading to the Clutter farmhouse. The 2 killers sat in the darkness for several minutes, studying the house and gathering their courage for what they were about to do. The farmhouse was dark except for a single light glowing in the basement window, the workshop light that Kenyon had forgotten to turn off. To Hickock and Smith, the light might have suggested that someone was still awake, but they had already committed themselves to this course of action. They had driven from Olathe, Kansas, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun, a hunting knife, rope, and adhesive tape, tools chosen specifically for what they planned to do. This wasn't an impulsive decision or a crime of opportunity. Every item in their possession had been selected for its usefulness in committing robbery, sexual assault, and murder. The farmhouse itself was a substantial 2-story structure, well-maintained and clearly prosperous. It sat isolated in the Kansas farmland, surrounded by outbuildings and machinery that spoke of a successful agricultural operation. The nearest neighbors were far enough away that screams would not be heard. Gunshots would not be investigated immediately. Hickock and Smith approached the house quietly, having already decided that they would leave no witnesses to their crime. They had discussed this repeatedly during the drive from Olathe. There could be no survivors to identify them, no matter what they found inside the house. They entered through an unlocked door, because in Holcomb, Kansas, in 1959, people still trusted their neighbors and their community. The Clutters had no reason to fear strangers in the night, no experience with the kind of random violence that was about to destroy their family. Here's where we need to examine the critical moment when these men crossed the line from planning to action. They stood in the Clutter kitchen in the middle of the night, knowing that upstairs were 4 innocent people sleeping peacefully in their beds. They could have turned around. They could have left. They could have chosen not to become killers. Instead, they made their way to Herbert Clutter's bedroom and woke him at gunpoint. When Herb asked what they wanted, they demanded to know where he kept his safe and his money. When Herb truthfully told them there was no safe, no large amount of cash in the house, they could have left with whatever small amounts of money they could find. But that was never their real intent. The robbery was just an excuse to gain access to the family. What they really wanted was the experience, the ultimate power, the power to take human life. They wanted to know what it felt like to execute another human being in cold blood, to play God with innocent victims who had done nothing to deserve their fate. The psychological dynamics between the 2 killers became crucial at this moment. Hickock was the planner and manipulator, but when it came time for actual violence, he preferred to let Smith take the lead. Smith, desperate for approval and acceptance, was willing to be Hickock's instrument of death in exchange for the partnership he had never found anywhere else. The killers forced Herb to wake his family and bring them upstairs to the bathroom. Upon rousing the Clutters, they pushed Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon into a bathroom on the 2nd floor of the house, then led Herb to his 1st floor office. After their initial search for a safe failed, they retrieved the other 3 members of the family from the bathroom. Picture the terror of that moment. A peaceful family roused from sleep by strangers with guns, Nancy in her nightgown clutching a robe around herself and trying to understand what was happening. Bonnie confused and frightened, her mental illness making the trauma even more overwhelming. Kenyon blinking in the harsh light, his teenage mind struggling to process the danger his family was facing. The killers then separated the family members, isolating them in different parts of the house. Bonnie's hands were tied in front of her. She was gagged, then tucked into bed in a room on the second floor. Nancy's hands were tied behind her. Inexplicably, she was not gagged and tucked into her bed in her own bedroom. Then the men took Herb and Kenyon to the basement. First, they gagged Kenyon, tied his hands behind his back, and tied the rope to an overhead steam pipe in the furnace room. Then they decided to cut him free and move him to the adjoining playroom. Bound and gagged, they set him at an oblique angle on the small couch and stuffed a white pillow behind his head. Each family member was alone with their terror, unable to comfort or protect the others. This wasn't accidental. It was psychological torture, designed to maximize their fear and helplessness. What happened next was methodical execution, carried out with deliberate cruelty. These weren't heat-of-the-moment killings or the result of a robbery gone wrong. This was cold-blooded murder. Herbert Clutter was killed first. Smith slit Herb Clutter's throat, then shot him in the head with the shotgun. He was found sprawled on a mattress in the basement furnace room, wearing pajamas, with his hands bound and mouth taped shut. Kenyon Clutter was found on the couch in the basement playroom, shot in the head while bound and gagged. Smith shot Kenyon to death after killing his father, the 15-year-old boy who had spent his last day working on a Christmas present for his sister, was murdered in the basement recreation area. Nancy Clutter was killed in her upstairs bedroom, shot in the head with the shotgun. They headed upstairs to the second floor, where they entered Nancy's room and shot her to death. The popular teenager who had spent her last day teaching a neighbor girl to bake and play guitar became the victim of senseless violence. According to Truman Capote's account in Cold Blood, Richard Hickock allegedly intended to rape Nancy Clutter, but Perry Smith prevented him from doing so. Smith claimed he stopped Hickock because he could not stand people who were unable to control their sexual impulses. There is no evidence that Nancy was actually sexually assaulted. Rather, Smith claimed he prevented the assault from occurring. The physical evidence suggested that Bonnie had been killed last, which means she spent her final moments knowing that her family was being murdered around her. The psychological torture of that realization adds another layer of cruelty to an already horrific crime. Let's pause to understand the psychology of what happened in the Clutter house. These weren't impulsive killings or the result of panic. Each execution was deliberate, calculated, carried out with the family members bound and helpless. The killers had time to think between each shooting. They moved methodically from room to room, from victim to victim, making a conscious choice to pull the trigger each time. They had multiple opportunities to stop, to show mercy, to choose humanity over cruelty. Instead, they completed their plan with the same cold efficiency they might have used to slaughter livestock. This tells us something terrifying about the human capacity for evil. Hickock and Smith weren't monsters in the supernatural sense. They were ordinary men who had made a choice to discard every moral restraint, every human instinct for compassion. They had decided that their desires mattered more than other people's lives, that their momentary gratification was worth more than 4 decades of human experience, love, and potential. Perry Smith later claimed that he killed all 4 family members to spare Dick Hickock from becoming a killer, suggesting that he acted alone in the actual murders. But this was psychological deflection, an attempt to minimize Hickock's guilt, while portraying himself as somehow merciful. The truth is that both men were equally culpable, equally intent on murder from the moment they entered that house. The sexual assault of Nancy Clutter reveals another dimension of the killer's psychology. This wasn't about sexual desire in any normal sense. It was about power and degradation. The assault was an act of ultimate domination, a way of exercising complete control over another human being before destroying her entirely. The methodical nature of the killings also reveals something about the killer's psychological state. They weren't operating in a frenzy or a rage. They were calm, controlled, almost businesslike in their approach to murder. This suggests a level of psychological detachment that is genuinely frightening. The ability to end human lives as casually as most people might swat flies. Sunday morning, November 15th, Nancy Ewalt, one of Nancy Clutter's friends, arrived at River Valley Farm that morning, expecting to accompany the Clutter family to church. When no one answered the door after repeated knocking, she and her father became concerned. The Clutters never missed church. They drove to the home of Susan Kidwell, Nancy's best friend, to see if she knew what might be wrong. When Susan attempted to phone the Clutters, no one answered. Mr. Ewalt, Nancy Ewalt, Susan, and her mother decided to return to the Clutter house to investigate. Susan and Nancy Ewalt were sent into the house, where they discovered Nancy Clutter's body in her bedroom. They ran out of the house screaming. The police, accompanied by Mr. Ewalt and local teacher Larry Hendricks, investigated the house and discovered the bodies of all 4 family members. Herb Clutter was found in the basement with his throat slashed and a shot in the head. Kenyon was also in the basement, bound and shot. Bonnie and Nancy were found in separate upstairs bedrooms, both shot in the head. The tragic irony was that the family who never missed church was discovered precisely because they were expected at church that Sunday morning. Their absence from such a fundamental part of their weekly routine immediately raised alarm bells in their close-knit community. The investigation was led by Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents Alvin Dewey and Harold Nye, experienced investigators who faced the challenge of solving a seemingly motiveless crime with few physical clues. The crime scene was processed methodically, but the killers had left behind little forensic evidence. 2 sets of boot prints in the basement provided some physical evidence, along with rope and tape used to bind the victims. But in 1959, forensic science was far less advanced than it is today. There was no DNA testing, no advanced ballistics analysis, no computer databases to cross-reference evidence. The investigators were faced with a crime that challenged every assumption about rural safety and criminal motivation. This wasn't a crime of passion, wasn't a robbery gone wrong in any conventional sense, wasn't connected to any obvious motive that made sense in the context of small-town Kansas life. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Floyd Wells, the inmate who had told Hickock about the supposed safe in the Clutter home, heard about the murders on the prison radio and realized what had happened. Wells contacted authorities, providing the crucial link between the crime and the 2 ex-convicts. Within weeks, a massive manhunt was underway. Dick Hickock and Perry Smith had fled Kansas immediately after the murders, beginning a cross-country flight that took them to Mexico and then across the American Southwest. They left a trail of bad checks, petty thefts, and stolen license plates that helped investigators track their movements. The manhunt involved multiple law enforcement agencies across several states. Hickock and Smith were living day to day, stealing what they needed and always staying 1 step ahead of the authorities. But they were also making mistakes, leaving evidence, drawing attention to themselves through their criminal activities. On December 30th, 1959, 6 weeks after the murders, the killers were finally captured in Las Vegas during a routine traffic stop. They had stolen license plates, which led to their arrest on minor charges. But investigators quickly realized who they had caught, and the evidence linking them to the Clutter murders began to pile up. In their possession were items stolen from the Clutter home, small things like Kenyon's radio and some of Herb's personal effects. More importantly, they had the shotgun used in the murders and could be placed in Kansas at the time of the crime through various witness accounts and physical evidence. Under interrogation, both men eventually confessed, though each tried to minimize his own role while implicating the other. Perry Smith ultimately confessed to pulling the trigger on all 4 victims, claiming he was trying to spare Hickock from becoming a killer. Hickock claimed he had tried to stop Smith, but was unable to prevent the murders. The confessions provided chilling details about their planning, their method of entry, and the cold calculation with which they had executed 4 innocent people. The randomness of the crime, the fact that the Clutters had been targeted simply because a fellow inmate had mentioned them, was perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the entire case. The trial of Dick Hickock and Perry Smith began in March 1960 and became a media sensation that drew reporters and spectators from across the country. The small courthouse in Garden City, Kansas, was packed to capacity as the community and the nation sought to understand how such a senseless crime could have happened. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Dwayne West, presented overwhelming evidence of guilt. The defendants' own confessions, physical evidence linking them to the scene, and testimony placing them in Kansas at the time of the murders created an airtight case that left little room for doubt about their guilt. The defense strategy focused on mental illness, arguing that both men were suffering from severe psychological disorders that made them unable to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the murders. Defense attorneys brought in psychiatrists who diagnosed both men with various mental illnesses and testified about their troubled backgrounds. But the jury, composed of local residents who had known and respected the Clutter family, was not swayed by arguments about mental illness. In the conservative rural culture of 1960s Kansas, there was little sympathy for killers who had destroyed such a good family, regardless of their psychological problems. The trial lasted for weeks, with testimony that revealed the full horror of what had happened in the Clutter house. Family members, friends, and community leaders testified about the impact the murders had on Holcomb and the surrounding area. The Clutter family was portrayed not just as victims, but as symbols of everything good about American rural life. Both Hickock and Smith were found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The verdict was hardly surprising, but it began a legal process that would stretch on for 5 years as the case moved through various appeals and legal challenges. During their years on death row at Kansas State Penitentiary, both men became the subjects of intense scrutiny from writer Truman Capote, who was researching what would become his masterpiece. In Cold Blood, Capote's relationship with the killers, especially Perry Smith, has become legendary in literary circles. Both Hickock and Smith revealed the psychological mechanisms that had led them to murder, providing insights that would influence criminology for decades. Hickock maintained his sociopathic personality, continuing to view others as objects to be manipulated. He showed little genuine remorse, unable to understand why society was punishing him so severely for what he viewed as a business transaction gone wrong. Smith presented a more complex picture, alternating between expressions of remorse and self-justification. Sometimes he seemed genuinely horrified by the murders, especially Nancy's death. Other times he portrayed himself as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. Their final statements revealed men unchanged by their experience. They had learned nothing, contributed nothing positive to human understanding. In the end, their deadly intent had accomplished nothing but creating more death, including their own. On April 14, 1965, Dick Hickock and Perry Smith were executed by hanging at Kansas State Penitentiary. Truman Capote was present, watching as the men who had provided material for his masterpiece paid the ultimate price for their crimes. The Clutter murders didn't end with the execution of Hickock and Smith. The case continued to ripple through time, influencing law enforcement procedures, literary culture, and our understanding of criminal psychology. But perhaps most significantly, it raised disturbing questions about what else the killers might have done during their 6 weeks on the run. Between November 15, 1959, when they killed the Clutters, and December 30th, when they were captured in Las Vegas. Hickock and Smith crisscrossed the American Southwest. During that time, they were desperate for money, operating in a heightened state of violence, and had already proven their willingness to kill entire families for relatively small amounts of cash. Law enforcement agencies began examining unsolved cases from that period, looking for possible connections to the fugitive killers. The pattern they established in Kansas, targeting isolated rural families, using extreme violence, showing no mercy for victims, could potentially explain other crimes that had puzzled investigators. But those questions would have to wait for another time, another investigation, another story. While the Clutter case was officially closed with the execution of Hickock and Smith, questions about their possible connection to other crimes remain an active area of investigation more than 60 years later. Modern forensic techniques have allowed investigators to re-examine evidence and explore links that weren't possible to investigate in the 1960s. The most significant recent development has been the ongoing investigation into whether Hickock and Smith were responsible for other unsolved murders during their weeks on the run. In 2012, their bodies were exhumed for DNA testing, an extraordinary step that demonstrated how seriously investigators took potential connections to other cases. The exhumation process was complex and unprecedented. Both men had been executed by hanging and buried in unmarked graves in Kansas. The preservation of usable DNA material after nearly 50 years underground was far from certain, but advances in forensic science had made such testing theoretically possible. The results, unfortunately, were inconclusive. The degradation of biological material over 5 decades made definitive DNA matching impossible, though certain genetic markers suggested possibilities that could neither be proven nor eliminated. The case continues to be studied by criminal justice researchers, behavioral analysts, and forensic scientists around the world. The wealth of documentation created by investigators, lawyers, and Truman Capote has made it one of the most thoroughly analyzed crimes in American history. The psychological profiles developed from Hickock and Smith have become templates for understanding partnership killers and the escalation of criminal behavior. Their case demonstrates how two individuals with different but complementary psychological disorders can amplify each other's worst tendencies, creating a criminal partnership more dangerous than either individual might have been alone. Modern behavioral analysis has also provided new insights into their methodology and psychology. The systematic nature of their crimes, their ability to compartmentalize violence, and their complete lack of empathy for their victims have helped law enforcement understand similar cases and develop better investigative techniques. The Clutter murders shattered America's innocence in ways that still resonate today. Before November 15, 1959, most Americans believed that such random violence happened in big cities, not in places like Holcomb, Kansas. The murders proved that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone. The case revealed something terrifying about the human capacity for motiveless violence. Herbert, Bonnie, Nancy, and Kenyon Clutter died not because they had wronged someone, not because they were involved in anything criminal or dangerous, but simply because two strangers decided their lives were worthless obstacles to what they wanted. The wheat still grows in the fields around Holcomb, rippling in the endless Kansas wind like golden waves stretching to the horizon. The farmhouse where the murders occurred has been torn down and replaced, but the community's memory of that terrible night remains fresh, even after more than 6 decades. The people of Holcomb learned to lock their doors after November 15, 1959. They learned to look twice at strangers and to question the safety they had always taken for granted. But they also learned that community bonds can survive even the worst tragedies, that human goodness persists even in the face of inexplicable evil. Herbert Clutter's legacy lives on in the wheat fields he loved, in the farming practices he championed, and in the community he served so faithfully. Bonnie's struggle with mental illness and her quiet strength inspire understanding and compassion. Nancy's bright spirit reminds us to cherish the enthusiasm and optimism of youth. And Kenyon's craftsmanship, the furniture he built with his own hands, still serves as a testament to the creative potential that was so brutally cut short. The Clutter case reminds us that evil often wears an ordinary face, that the monsters among us may be closer than we think, and that sometimes the deadliest intent hides behind the most charming smile. But it also reminds us of the importance of family, community, and the ordinary goodness that still exists in places like Holcomb, Kansas. But the questions raised by November 15, 1959 continue to haunt us. How do we protect ourselves from random evil? How do we maintain faith in human goodness when confronted with such senseless cruelty? And perhaps most urgently, what else did Dick Hickock and Perry Smith do during their weeks on the run? That last question leads us to another farmhouse, another family, another tragedy that may be connected to the killers immortalized in Cold Blood. Next week on Deadly Intent, we'll explore one of the most controversial cold cases in American criminal history. A case that would eventually lead investigators to exhume the bodies of Perry Smith and Dick Hickock in a desperate search for answers. The Walker family murders, a crime that may have been connected to the Clutter case, or may have been the work of entirely different killers. Either way, it's a story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the In Cold Blood murders. Until next time, stay safe. Stay vigilant, and beware the deadly intent that lurks in the human heart.